champion and facilitate the work you're doing. And I think really one thing that's really nice when I first heard this training before was it's really a nice example of how the multiple different offices work together to put this together for you. So the Vice President for Research Office, Vice President for Finance, Office of Government Counsel and Acquisition. So I think this is really an important thing. It's emblematic of where I'd like to see us work together in the future to try to do the things that help you do the work you need to get done for research. So please give us feedback on how well this worked for you and things that that will be useful for you in the future. So I will turn you back now to Dr. Randolph, and thanks again for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Quarter-Peter. Next slide, please. Ms. Whitmire from Office of Finance and Administration, Assistant Vice President, excuse me, within the Office of Finance and Administration, will bring introductions and an overview.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to also echo Dr. Quarter-Peter's welcome and say thank you all for attending the meeting this afternoon. We hope to share with you some helpful information and look forward to working with all of you. And next slide, please. Today's session is targeted to last about 2 hours. There will be additional time at the end for questions and answers. As Dr. Randolph mentioned, the session will be recorded and materials will be available after the session. We've undergone a lot of changes lately. There was new uniform guidance that took effect just last month. So there's been a lot of new regulations and changes, and that's kind of what we hope to present today. And we'd really like to work with you and all the presenters here to discuss the process of the application, from the initial application all the way to award. Next slide, please. Ultimately, the submission of the package is the principal investigator's responsibility. There are no shortcuts. The principal investigator is the final person who is ultimately responsible for the research. We're going to emphasize that throughout today's session. Of course, there are lots of persons who are providing technical assistance and advice to the PIs, but at the end of the day, it is the principal investigator's responsibility. Next slide, please. For those of you who have not used Google Meets very much, or you want to know how to submit your questions, if you see an icon in the upper right part of the screen, it's 3 geometric symbols, a triangle, a square, and a circle. If you click on that, it'll take you to a Q&A. You'll have the opportunity to post your question. And then I'd also like to mention that when we open the session up for questions, you may see someone else who has a similar question or a question that's largely the same as yours. All you need to do is click the little thumbs up symbol if you have the same question, and that'll add more. We'll see the number of people who raise their hand or want to emphasize that same question. And we'll priority-wise address those questions that sort of have the most commonality between our participants. And next slide, please. So at this point in time, I'm going to turn it over to my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Toya Randolph. Please take it away.
Thank you, Ms. Meyer. Next slide, please. One thing I'd like to reiterate before I get started with this slide, for those of you who are just joining the call, we are recording this session and it will be available on the VPR website. With regards to VPR updates, there are many VPR updates that have been released already and some that are to come. We have a new under recovery presidential policy memo that is being routed for signature. We've already put many of the processes in place, and that will be the formal document that we'll have on record. We also released additional DLAR per diem rates and guidance, as well as PI eligibility over the last 2 or 3 months. The PI eligibility for our office has not changed. However, Ms. Sarah Stanton will go into additional requirements for PI eligibility when she speaks that are required from the OGC office. The 3208 form, it is being updated to accommodate some of the requirements that AFRI now has, and it will be released in January of 2021. Once the updated 3208 form has been released, we will not be accepting any other forms or any other versions of that particular form. And lastly, with respect to site approval, many of you should have seen an email that went out on November 27th that really defined and updated site approval. We no longer provide conditional site approvals. Site approvals are required in order for any research project or educational project or sponsored project in general to be submitted to a sponsor. In the case where we are pending or awaiting OGC approval for a PI eligibility waiver request, we may issue contingent site approvals, but we will make that decision on a case-by-case basis. And so I invite you to go back to that email from November 27th and review the guidance with respect to site approvals. Next slide, please. These are just some of the acronyms that we frequently use, and we wanted to make sure that you all are aware of them. Next slide, please. This slide, and I'm glad, I'm not sure how clear it's projecting, but I'm glad that you all were given a copy of the slide deck in advance. So please refer to that slide deck if you cannot see this particular slide well. The reason why this slide is important because there are so many different types of applications that we receive within USU as a sponsor of research and sponsored activities, but also that we submit on behalf of USU. And this slide really goes over those types of different types of funding and different types of applications. Again, all applications to sponsors must be reviewed and approved by the CIO's office as well as the Office of Research. In some cases, the Office of General Counsel, as well as other various offices within finance and administration, will also need to review and approve. If we look at the table, the very first line says extramural, federal, not eligible. Those applications are typically the applications that will be sent will be submitted by one of our nonprofit partners, those of you on the phone, on behalf of USU and on behalf of the investigator. As you know, those require the Office of CIO as well as OSP review, but they also require, in many cases, the Office of General Counsel. And you can see that they're submitted by our nonprofit partner on behalf of the USU applicant, and the scientific review is conducted extramurally by that sponsor. The awards received are sent directly to the sponsor, directly to the nonprofit partner. Acquisitions is not involved, and with respect to award management, the Office of Research is always involved, but obviously that nonprofit partner is involved as well. The ones we're really focusing on for this particular training are the ones that are outlined here in red. Those are the extramural federal eligible, the DoD intramural, and the USU intramural. All of these require OSP review, Office of General Counsel review, and the OCIO review. This is the case where the USU is the applicant, and with respect to scientific review, the extramural sponsor will conduct that scientific review and coordinate the scientific review for extramural applications where federal agencies are eligible. But for the DoD intramural and the USU intramural, it could either be a VPR coordinated effort or it could be the sponsor. It just depends. In either case, in any of these cases, The Office of Budget at USU receives the award funds. And with respect to whether or not acquisitions is involved, it depends for most cases, but when it's a DoD intramural, it's almost always yes. And again, the awards are managed by the Acquisitions Office, the Office of Sponsored Programs, as well as the nonprofit partner that's selected to receive the award. Next slide, please. And at this point, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Sean Baker, who will speak on behalf of the office of the CIO's office. Over.
Thanks much, Toya, for the introduction, ma'am. If we could go to the next slide, please. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sean Baker. I'm the Chief Technology Officer here at the university. And I'm happy to join you today to talk about a little bit more about the research process and our role in it. As you saw on Toya's last slide there, we do reviews as part of each of the different types of awards or projects that you may be involved in. And in doing so, our goal is to help facilitate your research as quickly as we can while we work through our regulatory requirements. One of the most important things to understand about why we are involved is that regulatory piece. The university, its centers, and all of our programs are done and conducted as federal activities. And therefore, there are a number of public laws and regulations which apply to our work. Engaging early facilitates our review and helps you to avoid any IT complications as you get down the road. Now, in the history of the university, we have not always been involved in those reviews. And it's important to understand that our goal is never to get in the way of the research itself. And so if your program started out outside of compliance with CIO regulations, with the IT regulations, which the university is held to, typically we will try to grandparent those in. And as long as our teams can get together and we can talk through and tell a story to big DoD about how we are improving or maintaining the security and compliance of your research project through the changes which are being made as that project evolves, we're comfortable being your advocate in that regard. What we can't do is talk about how we're moving further from compliance or further from data security with iterative change. Now, for new start work, new programs which we need to engage on, the best thing you can do is to contact us at the email address, which is at the bottom of the screen here. When we go through that review process, we like to talk about there are two different ways we can do things, because we understand what it's like to design a research project, or as we've at least been through the process enough times to surmise. And that is, if you're going out and you're applying for funding, but you don't know yet that you're going to receive it, we're happy to sit down with you and talk about whether the research as designed is technically executable within our responsibilities at the university from an IT perspective only. I do not mean to represent involvement for any of my colleagues here on the call, but we can say, yes, that's possible, or no, that's not. Let's try to make some changes to your proposal and how that would work. Alternatively, or if you are already funded, we can go into a deep dive engagement where we talk about the very specifics. This is almost like a protocol level review where we look through your data management plan, how you're going to move information from point A to point B, and help you to identify those things which you're going to need to do in order to make sure that the project is successful on the ground. We can go either way on this. Early in things, that's really going to come down to how much time you have and with what level of detail you know what your budget is going to be required to be. Now, I would be remiss not to warn you that there are other things which go into these. Many of you who've been with the university for a period of time, and particularly if you circulate in the National Capital Region or collaborate with folks outside of the university proper, know that some of our partner locations have restricted access to different commodity services, or may not be able to do all the same things which we can here. So that's another point of consultation which we can offer you as you're designing your protocol to be able to think through what things are going to be available to you on the other side. Now, a minute ago, I also mentioned the fact that we can help you to identify those gotchas which are out there, like what's going to happen at the partner institutions. And one of those is around the need for data sharing and data use agreements. That is not a CIO responsibility. It is something which we have to track. We are involved in the approvals for, but it is not something where I sign on the dotted line as saying it's okay. I bring this up, though, because we had a great engagement. We've got a great working relationship with VPR and Ms. Randolph. And we, in our conversation yesterday, discovered how difficult this part of the process is for you all. And so we're going to be getting together and trying to give you some more succinct guidance on what that looks like going forward so that you've got a good go-by for reference. It's not prepared today. I'm not even ready to give you a date on which that will be announced. But when that does come out, it will be presented in the next version of this training. And of course, we'll make it available to you online. With that, Toya, that concludes everything I have prepared today. I thank you all for attending and for your future engagements with us.
Thank you, Sean. Next slide, please.
Good afternoon. My name is sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to introduce here from Sade Randall, Ms. Sade Randall and Ms. Kaisha Drake from the Office of Sponsored Programs. Sade will provide an overview of the pre-award process, and Kaisha will provide an overview of the post-award process. Thank you, Sade.
Thank you. And before I begin, I do want to acknowledge the OSP staff who helped contribute to the OSP slides. Drs. Toya Randolph and Dr. Leodian Baljanowski, Mrs. Yvette Prince, Ms. Janine Paschal, Mrs. Kaisha Drake, and myself. Next slide, please. Effective January 1st, 2021, the OSP department assignments will change. Please look over the department assignment sheet to determine if you are assigned a new grants management specialist. Should you have any questions, our contact information is listed, and we will be happy to assist you. Next slide, please. Today, I will be discussing the policies, PI eligibility and under recovery program, the USU sponsored programs approval request SPAR form and the project shared folder, the OSP pre-award flowchart, the OSP grants management specialist GMS review, as well as the directorate review, the conditional site approval, and FAQs. Next slide, please. Civilian faculty must be billeted at USU, and active duty military faculty must be assigned to USU to serve as the principal investigator, the PI, on extramural or intramural research projects. Should you require a PI eligibility waiver, please submit the following documents: a USU Form 3208, a PI eligibility waiver request memo from the department chair, the PI CV and BioSketch. Please include foreign support received or to be awarded from foreign entities and or governments, the current, pending, and previous support, the faculty appointment letter. This faculty appointment letter does not apply to students or AFRI faculty, the proposal, budget, and budget justification, the financial interest disclosure form. And if you have questions about any of these forms, you may contact us. For full PI eligibility waiver approval, it can take a minimum of 2 to 3 weeks. Next slide, please. The Under Recovery Program, ERP, is requested when indirect cost is not covered or partially covered by the sponsor. For USU approval, all federal, meaning civilian and military, are eligible. You will receive approval to submit through USU or the nonprofit partner. The required documents are a detailed budget and budget justification. PIs should include their salary level of effort. PI salary is included as a direct cost. The proposal or statement of work, the program announcement or guidelines, the Under Recovery Program request memo. Please include on the memo the PI name, project title, proposed start and end date, the sponsor's name, sponsor allowed indirect costs, proposed total funding amount, the total indirect costs allowed at the sponsor's rate, the full indirect cost amount, and the total anticipated under recovery. The timeline for approval is approximately 2 business days. For nonprofit partner approval, you are eligible if you are a contractor, faculty, and or student. You will receive ERP approval from the nonprofit partner. The nonprofit partner will provide those documents for IRP requests upon submitting your request to them. Next slide, please. The purpose of the approval request form is to notify the OSP staff that a faculty member, graduate student, or fellow requires research administration support from the extramural office. Therefore, the title on the USU project intake form has changed to the USU Sponsored Programs Approval Request, SPAR form. We've also added 2 additional questions. One question, does this request pertain to a core program? If you need help determining that answer, we've included a definition as well as a point of contact. We've also added the question, have you received the Office of the Chief Information Officer, OCIO, approval? If yes, we ask that you upload the approval into your project shared folder. If not, please contact the office and the information is listed there. The request form must be completed at least 2 weeks before the sponsor's deadline in order to receive a project shared folder. The grants management specialist will issue a project shared folder within 2 business days of receipt of the request form. All required documents must be uploaded to the project shared folder 7 business days before the sponsor deadline. Please note, the uploaded documents will remain in pending status until we are notified that you've submitted and uploaded the documents. Next slide, please. This slide contains the OSP pre-award process from the PI submitting the proposal to OSP for review and approval to when the proposal is submitted to the sponsor from USU or the nonprofit partner. I apologize in advance if you cannot read it. However, you can reference this slide with your materials if you have any questions pertaining to the steps of receiving your assigned USU Form 3208. I do want to point out the timeline for full proposal review with no errors. It can take 3 to 4 business days from OSP specialist review to OSP Directorate review and approval. Proposal review with errors can take 3 to 7 business days, depending upon when the PI or the program manager corrects the errors. Next slide, please. The grants management specialist performs an administrative review to ensure the proposal package complies with the sponsor's guidelines and USU policies, to check for incompleteness, inaccuracies, and omissions in the documents, to confirm the correct use of IDC and SCR rates, indirect costs and support cost recovery, and the federal compliance costs, FCC, to verify the budget calculations and items are accurate, to confirm the budget justification is sufficient in detail and in compliance with the appropriate regulations, policies, and prohibitions, and to ensure the USU Form 3208 has the appropriate signatures and assurances. Before I move on to the next slide, I would like to go over a few common mistakes that we noticed during our proposal review. The project title in the 3208 must be correct and consistent across all documents. The PI % effort in the 3208 must match the budget and budget justification. There should be a chair's delegation of authority for absent department chairs if the PI is uploading the submission when the chair is out of the office. When the department chair is also the PI or co-PI, a higher authority needs to sign the 3208 in place of the department chair. When scientific overlap is checked, an explanation must be attached. If you have checked yes for foreign research, please contact the Office of Affiliations and International Affairs for guidance and inform OSP of the final decision. If another PI from a different department has more than 5% on the project, that PI's department chair must also sign the USU Form 3208. If you have any questions about what was discussed, please reach out to us. Next slide, please. After the administrative review by the GMS, the OSP director reviews the documents to ensure the proposed topic is relevant to the health and readiness of uniformed personnel and/or their families. Confirm USU has the necessary resources to complete the project, or the budget includes costs for those resources. To consider the proposed collaborations, making sure there's evidence of the collaboration, and recommending additional collaborations that may improve the application. Confirm the proposal is readable. There should be no typos, grammatical mistakes, or spelling errors, and is reasonable or makes sense overall. As Dr. Randolph has mentioned, please note effective as of November 2020, a signed USU Form 3208 is required for the PI or nonprofit partner to submit to the sponsor. Next slide, please. The intent of conditional site approvals were to allow our nonprofit partners to submit applications while required actions were still. Our experience has been that conditional site approvals result in incomplete OSP files and delayed notice of awards. So effective as of December 11, 2020, a conditional site approval will no longer be issued to PIs in lieu of a site approval, which is now the signed USU Form 3208. Contingent site approvals will be provided to the PI when there is a pending request for a PI eligibility waiver. Next slide, please. I've included a few pages of frequently asked questions, and I will read the questions for each. If you would like to answer, please reference the slides. Do all of my sponsored programs need to come through OSP? Where are the forms located? When should I submit my application through a nonprofit partner? The next slide. Why do I have to include support costs on my budget? When does FCC apply? Do I need something from OSP in order to submit an application? Next slide. What are the requirements for EBRAP submissions? Next slide. Why are certain applications made using NIH Assist? Thank you. That wraps up the pre-award OSP process, and I'm going to move it over to Mrs. Kaisha Drake for post-award.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Ms. Randall. Let's jump right into our OSP post-award agenda for today. We will discuss just-in-time, notification of award, OSP post-award flowchart, notice of research approval, modifications, reporting, and award closeout. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Just-in-time documents. Some sponsors require just-in-time documents prior to award. Just-in-time documents include, but are not limited to, assurance approvals listed on the 3208, IRB, IACUC, and biosafety, just to name a few, percent effort verification, current and pending project verification. Please note that the required documents may vary pending the sponsor. However, OSP will require verification documents and a written request from the sponsor. This request will take 2 to 3 business days prior to the due date of the request. The notice of award. This is provided to the awardee from a sponsor acknowledging funding. This document is required by OSP to ensure we are in compliance with the USU regulations and there's no delay in processing funding and spending account verification. The notice of award is provided to the awardee and/or submitting agency from the sponsor. OSP encourages our PIs to provide this notice so that we are able to update your documentation in real time. Next slide, please. OSP post-award chart. This is a flow chart with a full view of the OSP post-award process from the portion where OSP will receive the notice of funding, the NOR is completed and submitted. Please use this as a guide to reference and understand the OSP post-award process. Again, this may be a little blurry, so please have this as a reference and print it out for you. Next slide, please. Notice of research approval. This is a confirmation a project is research or non-research, military relevant, and would be funded in accordance with the financial management regulation. Next, we'll discuss the steps of the NOR. OSP receives notification of USU funding via the BPR site database. This database is where each specialist checks the status of funding provided to USU for awarded projects. PIs will submit a new USU Sponsored Programs Approval Form, SPAR. After the form is completed, the Grants Management Specialist will provide a folder and share it with the PI for submissions of the required documents. Once the documents are received, the Grants Management Specialist and the Directorate will perform a detailed review of the revised documents, ensuring the budget matches the funding amount received, the PI has not changed, and all updated documents pertaining to the award are received. The OSP Directorate will approve all the revised documents and sign the USU Form 3208. Once the 3208 is signed, the Grants Management Specialist will execute the NORA in the VPR database. I wanted to point out a few key points about the NORA. The NORA is processed at the award stage once funding arrives at the university. The NORA will be completed only when funding is administered by USU. The NORA is not a physical document to be presented to the PI. However, it's a part of the process when a NOBA is received. Next slide, please. This chart is an outline of expectations and requirements for NORA modifications. Types of modifications include change or addition to the statement of work, change in the project title with any changes in the SOW, objectives, budget, or performance sites, minor corrections to the project title, no change in objectives, SOW, research plan, or budget, change or new budget amount of a previous active existing project requested by the PI with sponsor's approval, OCIO request for revised SOW, research plan, or budget, funding for additional personnel, personnel added with no additional funding for the project with IRB or IACUC oversight, funding for additional equipment, performance sites, locations, added or changed with or without additional funding. Please use this chart as a reference if a 3208 SPAR form or email and supporting documentations are required for a modification review. Next slide, please. OSP reports. This chart outlines OSP reports along with the processing time and the required documents for each. The first report I'm going to discuss is an annual report, which will take 1 to 2 business days. The Form 3208 and 3210 are required. Please note that the annual report must include the signatures of the PI and the department chair on the cover page of the 3210. Acquisitions annual report and the sponsors report will be accepted. However, the 3210 cover page will be required for OSP. Final report, a 3210 will only be required, which will take 3 to 5 business days. Something else that we wanted to point out to make sure everyone makes a note of, that all reports must meet the terms and conditions of the sponsor. If a department chair is the PI on a project, both the 3208 and the 3210 will need to be signed by a higher authority. Next slide, please. OSP modifications. The first modification type I'm going to discuss will be a PI transfer that will take 3 to 5 business days. The documentation required for the current PI is the 3210, a request memo from the department chair and current PI, a sponsor approval memo. Please note that the memo requesting the PI change needs to explain when they are expected to leave, identify the nominated prospective PI, and a brief statement of accomplishments of the candidate. The prospective PI will need a memo accepting the position, a 3208, CV or bio, budget justification, and statement of work. Another note is that the sponsor approval memo should be on the letterhead. However, we will accept an email as well. Grant transfer. This will take 3 to 5 business days. The forms required for a grant transfer will be a 3208, 3210, new department chair approval memo, justification memo, budget and budget justification, and a statement of work. If you're having a grant transfer for an external entity, you will need a 3208, budget justification, progress report, terms and conditions of the award, approval and acceptance letter from the original funding agency and from the new site. Next, I will discuss the no-cost extension, which will take 3 to 5 business days as well, a 3208, a 3210, justification memo, budget and budget justification, along with the SOW and sponsor approval will be required. Next slide, please. Award closeout. When an award is ready to close out, the PI or the PM should submit the USU sponsored programs approval request form with the items listed: a final financial report, assurance closeout, technical closeout report, cooperative agreement, and all other sponsored required closeout documents. When proper documentation is received, the PI will receive an email response that the items have been received and will process closeout. Next slide, please. Acronyms and VPR forms link. The final slide shows all of OSP's acronyms and a link to our 3208, 3210, and assurance appendix. This will conclude OSP's pre and post-award presentation. We hope that you found this information helpful. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you, Mrs. Drake. Thank you, Ms. Randall. This brings us to our first poll question. Next slide, please. For those of you who are not familiar with the poll feature in Google Meet, the very same 3 triangle, square, and circle activities button that we directed you to, that Ms. Whitmire directed you to ask your questions. I ask you to click that, and Mr. Martinez will release the responses to our first poll. The question is here, and it is: in order to serve as a PI at USU, he or she must be A, a civilian billeted at USU, B, a contract employee, C, an active duty member assigned to USU, D, all of the above, E, A and B, or F, A and C. I invite you to respond to the poll, and we'll give you about 30 seconds to do so. Okay, we'll take another 10 seconds, and then Tony, if you don't mind closing the this particular poll. Thank you. Please close the poll and show the answer to all the answers. Okay, thank you. If you're still in the poll feature, you will see that the majority of respondents selected F. F is the correct answer. The only way that B is allowed, a contract employee is allowed to serve as a PI, is if they have a waiver to the USU PI eligibility rule, which is that civilian billeted faculty members as well as active duty members who are assigned to USU may serve as PIs. Thank you for participating in that poll. With that, I will ask Tony to shift to the next slide and ask Dr. Susan Rasmussen to present on behalf of Regulatory Initiatives and Compliance.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm representing Regulatory Initiatives and Compliance. Next slide, please. One thing to note is that regulatory compliance interweaves between both pre and post award. It's something that the PI needs to think of when they're putting together their research that they're submitting to the sponsor. It's also something that happens after the fact. It's considered typically to be a just-in-time type of regulatory approval. This includes both human research, animal research, biosafety, and anatomical materials. Each of these offices are open and available at any time for consultation. In fact, we encourage it. The more often you come by, we can help you avoid pitfalls and other issues that may arise during your approval process. This is especially important with human research, as there are often stipulations or other issues that are required before approvals from the various regulatory committees can be done. Listed here are the primary contact emails for each of those offices. There will be an additional training in depth on each of these offices in the spring, and we invite you to come to that when we present it. And that's all that I have. Thank you for your attention.
Next slide, please.
So,
Dr. Dahl?
Toya, should I? Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear? Okay. Again, good afternoon, and I'd add my welcome to everyone else for your attendance at an important overview of many of the functions that support you. Mine in particular has to do with the technological research and innovation. If you can display the slide that has the graphic of VPR, that slide shows TRI on the right-hand side. And for the purposes of today's discussion, I'm just going to focus on the first two blocks underneath TRI, which is BIC, the Biomedical Instrumentation Center, and DLAR, which is the Division of Laboratory Animal Resources. There are other functions we have, but suffice it that these are probably the most relevant to you for today's discussion. So as far as the next slide, which is the DLAR slide, this is where all of the animal models that are part of the ongoing animal research reside. There is a staff of physicians, veterinarians led by Colonel Carrie Benton for the purposes of assisting the PIs, as well as there is a residency ongoing for, you might say, the younger veterinarians who are in their career, that is, for the purposes of getting residency training in a particular area, large animal, small animal, so on, laboratory animal. And there is quite a variation of different animals. You have ferrets, you have rats, several types of rodents, you have swine, you have non-human primates. There are aquatic species as well. And these change sometimes as a result of the different ways that models are best used for the different research questions. To their credit, they have continued unabated by what is imposed by the COVID crisis, the COVID pandemic, and they continue to work very closely with the VPR offices as well as with all the PIs. Colonel Benton certainly is very forward-leaning in having one-on-ones with new researchers. So if any of you in the audience fall into that category, please feel free to discuss with her whatever your plans are as it may relate to animal models. If you go to the next slide, the Biomedical Instrumentation Center slide, this is not meant to be an eye chart, but since I know you're getting copies of these, the intent is to have those summaries in front of you for the 5 areas that the BIC oversees. This is led by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Bain, who is also a veterinarian. And there are the 5 areas of genomics, histopathology, structural biology, flow cytometry, and microscopic imaging. And within each of those, there are various pieces of equipment, state-of-the-art equipment, which are available to the PIs given whatever your respective technology needs are. A review is done every year of whether there are new pieces of equipment to consider purchasing or others that may not be current anymore and therefore may need to be surveyed. All of this being part of the process to stay current with support to the PIs. So with that, I'll also add that we are planning a more detailed discussion of our respective division within VPR at a later date. This was merely to whet your taste, and certainly if you have any questions, feel free to forward those to myself or the leadership that I mentioned. Thank you for your time and opportunity. Back to you, Dr. Randolph.
Thank you, Dr. Dahl. Next slide, please. Mr. Andy Gwynn will discuss the Financial Management Directorate.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andy Gwynn. I'm the Chief of the Budget Office and the Agreements Office, and we'll talk about both of those in the next few slides. Next chart, please. Okay, so in the Budget Office, our part in the NORA NOVA review is once we get the money into the USU, we'll go ahead and load that in the database, and then we'll wait for the NORA to come through from OSP. And then we'll do a lot of the same things that OSP has probably already done. We'll do a last check on the budget, making sure that the latest version of the template is used, which you can find right, that it's completed in its entirety, starting from the Start Here tab. The budgets match the total amount of funding that we receive. Indirects, FCC charged appropriately. We'll review the SAL and make sure that the SAL matches the type of funding, either RDT&E or education, research, O&M. And there's a justification for every item on the budget template, and it ties back to the SAL. Once the budget, the NORA, and everything has been reviewed and everything looks good, we'll go ahead and do the notice of budget approval. We'll complete that. We'll send a notification to our RMI office, and they will enter the PR in the system. And then the RMI office will notify the PI that the PR has been completed, and we'll also send them a copy of the NOVA. And that's basically what budget does in a high-level version. And I'll say that the budget office is here to support every one of you. You can reach out to me anytime, and we'll give you whatever assistance we can. Next chart. Okay, the agreements section. As you're probably aware, or maybe not, every time we work with an external agency and we're going to exchange funds, personnel, proprietary information, we'll need to first establish an agreement. The principal investigators should go online to the Agreements Online Request form to start the agreements process. You can find that on the home page, go to the A to Z tab, and then look up agreements. And note, please, that the online agreement request form is only accessible to folks that are at USU. So we often get agreement requests via email from the external agencies, but we'll need the initiation of the agreement to be started by the USU PI by submitting the online database form. We'll vet the submissions. We'll direct them to the appropriate office and specialist based on the type of agreement needed. Your agreements office that work for me will manage memorandums of understanding, memorandums of agreement, and interagency agreements. The agreements managed through the Joint Office for Technology Transfer, the JOT. They'll take care of data use agreements, material transfer agreements, and CRADAs, cooperative research and development agreements. Narrative agreements, MOUs and MOAs, just to give you a heads up, may take 4 months or more to complete, and a lot of that's just based on the responsiveness of the parties to the staffing. So a lot of times it either go to an external agency and it'll take a while to get back, or a lot of times we may run into some questions that we got to chase down and get answers to, and that'll slow the process down. Next chart, please. Okay, funding agreements. We're going to need to enter into an interagency agreement if we're going to accept or provide funds to another party. There are two parts to the interagency agreement. The general terms and conditions is the 7600A, that's the form number, and the funding document is the 7600B. The general terms and conditions is essential to the IA because it establishes the agreement period, the scope of the work, and an estimated agreement amount, which is a funding ceiling. So if this is going to be a 5-year agreement, you're going to put 5 years worth of funding on the 7600A, and then that'll be funded with the 7600B and other funding mechanisms. Okay, I got ahead, so we do the max agreement period of 5 years. Okay, so this next note we added after our last review. Please note for the agreement specialist, if you know this, whether the funds must be obligated by the particular date or expended by the date. So when we get a 7600B, there is a period of performance on the 7600B. That's the funding piece for usually 1 year, and it'll have a period of performance end date. Our view of the period of performance end date is that we have until that end date to get the money obligated. And in most cases, that would be put on a cooperative agreement. Some external agencies view the period of performance end date on that 7600B as the date when you must stop working on whatever it is you're doing. You have to be complete with the research. Very important that we are in sync with the external agency, because those two things are totally different. So we've run into some issues where we kept working after the end date on the period of performance that gave us money, and then when we invoiced the external agency, they rejected that invoice and said we should have stopped on the end date on the 7600B. So we'll get that straightened out beforehand. And if you don't know, we'll reach out and we'll help you find the answer. Also note that an IAA is not a multi-party agreement. So it's just between us and one external agency. Okay, funding documents that we use, the 7600B, which I already mentioned. We also, once we have an A, and the A is actually the agreement, and then the funding documents, the 7600B MIPR. We might do a GFIBS direct charge if the external agency uses GFIBS also, or we might get a FAD through DHA. We won't take any funding on any of those documents if there is not an active general terms and conditions agreement with 7600. We have to have that. When we get the request for an IA, we're going to be looking for a statement of work, budget justification to support the document. Some external agencies, even though a general term and condition of 7600A is an agreement, they also require a memorandum of agreement for supporting documentation, and they put additional details in that memorandum of agreement. So that could slow down the process just a little if we got to get one of those. Otherwise, funding agreement typically is fairly quick, 1 to 4 weeks to complete, provided everybody's responsive to the staffing. So plenty of coordinating for that amount of time. And I think that is the last chart I have. The Agreements Office is ready to help you out if you need something. You can email me and I'll put you in touch with somebody. Thank you.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Next, we have Ms. Victoria Cunningham speaking on behalf of the Acquisitions Directorate.
Thank you, Dr. Randolph. So good afternoon. My name is Victoria Cunningham. I serve as the Deputy Director of Acquisitions, and today I'm going to be speaking to you about a few changes to the Code of Federal Regulations, specifically to CFR 200, which directly affects grants and cooperative agreements. And I'm also going to be discussing some lessons learned from FY20, which I hope will be helpful as we move into the FY21 cycle of activities. Next slide, please. So first, let's talk a little bit about the regulatory changes that are coming down the pike to grants and cooperative agreements. So it's important to keep in mind that this is the first major overhaul of regulations in the last 5 or 6 years. And while the regulations have been changed to reflect a whole host of updates, everything from standardizing data and reporting to implementation of statutory requirements, the most significant change is the one that's currently affecting programs and projects, which is specifically how to describe the work being conducted under federal assistance awards. So the notable change is that there is now a requirement to document performance goals for projects and programs. And taking it a step further, there must also be a plan for performance assessment. While we have received some implementation guidance and regulatory updates, there are still requirements which are evolving and being vetted for implementation by DoD, OMB, and others. So in the interim, we have created a template to assist in the preparation of some of this documentation. I believe some of you may have received the template this week. It was entitled the Project Narrative Template. It is also posted to our ACQ website for reference. We'll talk a little bit more about that template in a moment. But essentially, as you're working on your project and program plan, I'd like to encourage you to keep in mind a few things. I want you to keep in mind thinking about what are those performance goals or indicators or other performance targets that can be established for the work. How can that performance of the work be assessed against these goals? What metrics could you potentially incorporate and use? These questions are particularly important since we are required to ensure that the answers to these questions are well documented in any resultant award that ACQ issues. So discussing how the details of the project or program are captured really does segue into my first lesson learned of FY20. So there's been a lot of discussion, in some cases a little confusion around terminology that gets thrown around. We hear everything from statement of work or SOW to statement of objectives or SU or just narrative or package. So to be clear, when we're talking about a statement of work or a statement of objectives, those are really primarily contractual terms. So I do want to take a moment just to course correct the terminology a bit. So when we're doing a write-up for a grant or cooperative agreement, and we're delineating things like your public purpose, and you're describing the work or the aims of your project or program, what you're ultimately going to be providing is a project narrative. This narrative is a detailed description of the proposed project or program activities. It's going to include objectives of the project or program and detail the implementation plan, specifically how these goals will be accomplished. The narrative should also include things like relevant background for your project or program, including that public purpose statement. It should include deliverables that are associated with your project or program. This could include milestone meetings, reports that are received, or any data that's received. There should also be those metrics or a measurement plan to evaluate the success or the outcomes of the project. And you're going to want to include that schedule or milestone schedule associated with your project or program. In addition to these things, and I know that this is a long list, the narrative also should clearly delineate the tasks and the areas that each party is responsible for. So for instance, the narrative should delineate the tasks or the work that USU will be responsible for completing versus what the recipient is responsible for completing. Some of you may even have project or program activities that include subrecipients who will be involved. And so the narrative should also highlight what they are responsible for as well. This is going to save some time up front in the ACQ's review of the project narrative, if it is clear and detailed in these various areas. The second lesson learned I want to touch upon today is just ensuring that there is consistent data and information across all of the documentation and that any requests that are submitted are clear. So historically, our office has spent a great deal of time going back and forth on questions, in some cases due to inconsistencies across the documentation. So as a quick illustration, all of your documents, your project narrative, your budget, and your budget justification should all track to each other and should align. So the project narrative should support the budget categories that are listed on the budget spreadsheet. And the budget justification should then align with the budget categories and properly support the budget categories proposed. So as a quick example, let's say that the narrative details a large component of laboratory-based work. So materials will be needed in the conduct of this work. The project narrative should highlight the work to be performed. The materials should be a budget category in the budget document. And the budget justification should explain the types of materials anticipated and provide supporting details concerning the material costs. The materials proposed in both type and amount should be sufficiently supported to ensure that they are reasonable based on the project narrative provided. In addition to ensuring that the documentation is consistent, it's also important to ensure that there is sufficient detail to support the costs and the cost categories proposed. Often we spend a great deal of time trying to obtain the supporting details of the costs, or in some cases, just more robust justifications. So it's important to explain what exactly it is that you're purchasing or what is needed, and then provide that supporting documentation or a justification as to how the proposed cost was established. This upfront work is going to save review time once the package does arrive in our office for action. I also mentioned clarity concerning requests, and that is also an important point to note here. So for instance, we see a lot of no-cost extension requests. So if, for instance, you have a no-cost extension request that's submitted, it's important to justify why the no-cost extension is needed. It would not be sufficient to just indicate that the funding has not been fully expended. It's important to address things that deal with the why. Things like there may have been delays in obtaining approvals, whether it be IRB approvals or other authorizations. There could have been delays experienced related to patient recruitment for a study. There could be other unforeseen issues that delayed accomplishing certain goals or objectives of your project or program within the originally established period of performance. So it's important to provide those details upfront when submitting your request. It's also important to emphasize or explain any project or program plan that you have to complete the program goals or project goals within the requested no-cost extension timeframe. So for instance, if you need, let's say, an additional year to complete the work, do you have a high degree of confidence that all the goals will be accomplished by then? Do you have a plan in place to accomplish that and ensure that that occurs? Those would be some additional details that you'd also want to think about and provide as part of your planning and as part of your request. One last note I do want to make regarding requests in general. It is critical to remember that the review timelines presented by OSP earlier in the presentation are tied to their review only and their steps only. What it doesn't necessarily account for are the steps or a timeline once OSP completes their review. So it's important to remember that depending on the request, additional parties in USU may need to review, and the recipient will also take time to finalize any request and send it to the Acquisitions Directorate. Basically, my takeaway for you all is that the sooner you can get those requests identified and in the process for approval, review and approval, the better. I'm going to transition now to the third lesson learned. It's really important to establish supportable, realistic budgets and supportable, realistic timeframes for completing the project or program. You should take into account when doing some of the planning of a project or program budget, what costs are required, who is incurring them. Again, going back to this delineation between, is it the recipient's task area responsibility? Is it a subrecipient? You'll want to think about when these costs are going to be incurred and what budget year, and whether or not it's a recurring cost. You should plan for that if it is. And just be sure, again, to justify your costs and support your costs in your budget justification. It's also important, again, to emphasize the realistic timeframes for completion. So when doing your project and program planning, how long will it take to accomplish the project objectives that you've set forth? Does the timeline account for all of the necessary requirements? You know, there might be certain approvals, authorizations, and things of that nature that you need to account for. So as you might recall, when I began speaking today, we talked a little bit about changes to regulations, and that those changes to the regulations really are directly resulting in increased requirements around monitoring performance. So this is the framework really for the next lesson learned on the slide. There are two major ways that we can begin our compliance in this area of performance monitoring that I'd like to take a moment to highlight for you today. The first is monitoring the technical progress of the projects and programs, and the second is monitoring the project and program expenditures. So let's first talk about monitoring the technical progress. It's important to ensure that as you're receiving progress reports or other data and information, that you're reviewing that and that you're monitoring that. And remember to communicate about the status of a project if it's lagging, delayed, or in some way falling behind or not meeting those goals and objectives in accordance with the schedule laid out. You'll want to also look at the potential for implementing a plan of action to correct any technical delays and get that resolved. Federal employees specifically who are involved should be communicating with ACQ when rebudgets are needed or the goals of projects are changing. If contractors are, serving in some level of management or oversight, they should be directing their communications to their respective grants office. Federal employees also should be assessing whether there is a discussion with the recipient that's necessary regarding their performance. In some cases, if there's a delay and that needs to be addressed, as a group, we need to coordinate a discussion. So I would ask that you please work with the grants officer and ACQ so we can help facilitate any discussions that are needed with the recipient. Monitoring expenditures are similar in nature in terms of the questions that you'll be asking and things you'll be looking at. So you're going to want to be thinking about how much funding, looking and monitoring how much funding is actually remaining on these agreements. Federal employees should be communicating with ACQ regarding things like no-cost extensions earlier rather than later. Don't wait until the month your project expires, or worse yet, I've seen the day that your project expires. If there is not sufficient time to review and approve the request, ACQ, we can't guarantee that the agreement will be reviewed and extended in time to prevent a lapse of performance. Also, as planning is underway for subsequent funding on an agreement or funding for new agreements, if there is funding still remaining, but additional funds have been provided to support the program or project, ACQ, we're looking to partner closely with the PIs to determine the timing of that funding. So please engage with us early so we can determine the best path forward for funding your existing agreements and also your new agreements. The last item that I do want to briefly mention kind of takes us back to the impact of the increased regulations and requirements. It's really important to remember that with those increased regulatory requirements comes the increased responsibility for monitoring the projects and programs in some of the ways that we talked about. The monitoring piece, I cannot underscore enough how critical that is. We're already seeing an increase in data calls, reporting requirements associated with grants and cooperative agreements, and I have every expectation that this will continue. So things like technical progress, obligations, remaining funds, these are just some of the areas that are being critically monitored and that we're being asked to report on regularly. The monitoring of these programs and projects is critical to these efforts in order for USU to continue to meet its requirements and to remain in compliance with these regulations and the evolving policies. So with that said, I would like to close and just say, as always, please do not hesitate to reach out to our team of grants officers. I know that there are a number of changes in FY21, and we want to work with you to facilitate your efforts in light of all of these changes. We're here to do everything we can to position the USU projects and programs for success. So please reach out to our office with any questions, concerns, or any issues at all. And I think with that, I believe, Dr. Randolph, you can correct me, I think we have an upcoming poll question.
We do, thank you, and it's a poll question from your office. Next slide, please. Before we begin this next poll, I would like to make sure that you all understand, all of the participants on the phone understand the Q&A function again. Please go to that little activity, as it's called. If you scroll over the activity that has a triangle, square, and circle, if you click on it, the first option says breakout rooms, the second option says polls, and the last option says Q&A. Right now, we are using the poll function, but we will move to the Q&A at the end of this training. Right now, we only have 4 questions, and of course, we can answer those 4. But I encourage you that if you have questions and you have all of the those responsibility centers on the line to respond to your questions. Please add your questions there. With that, let's click on poll for poll question 2. Again, poll question 2, Mr. Martinez has it here displayed. It says, if you are a contractor and you have a question concerning a cooperative agreement that USU has issued to your organization, who should you contact first to address your question? I'll ask everyone to respond to this question, give you 30 seconds, and Ms. Cunningham, I'll ask you to tell us what the correct answer is once I close the poll. Okay, it doesn't look like we have a lot more activity in terms of responses. I'll give it a few more seconds. Okay, Tony, if you'd close the poll and show the results, and Ms. Cunningham, if you don't mind sharing the actual correct answer.
Sure. If you are a contractor, then your first stop is actually going to be your organization's grant specialist or grants department.
Thank you. So that means that B is the correct answer. If you answered B, it's the correct answer. If you did not, then it's a learning opportunity. Thank you so much, Victoria. Next slide, please. Looks like we have another poll question, and I think this is the final one for the day. I'm going to turn this poll question over to Ms. Stanton.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I am one of 4 full-time attorneys in the Office of General Counsel, so this poll question is coming to you sponsored by the Office of General Counsel. USU's Center for the Advancement of Important Medicine, AIM, operates with a core staff provided through a cooperative agreement that USU funds with the Foundation for Uniform Support for Defense General Education, FUDGE, or nonprofit. These nonprofit personnel are highly experienced technical experts who are relied on by AIM to conduct a wide array of tasks in running the center and to carry out various funded projects. Many nonprofit personnel have faculty appointments at USU, including MS Contractor PhD, a scientist with more than 20 years working experience at nonprofit. AIM does a lot of collaborative work with NIH and the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. Nonprofit also has its own independent collaborations with NIH and Walter Reed. Toward the end of the fiscal year, AIM's director announces to senior AIM staff that DHA has a $15 million funding available on short notice for AIM's research and charges everyone to aim high and find good projects to quickly use the funds. Dr. Contractor, a longtime USU adjunct assistant research professor, leaps into action and begins to represent AIM on calls and in email correspondence with DHA officials in order to scope the intent, to develop research parameters, and to pitch possible research projects. Dr. Contractor then drafts several new research proposals for AIM to use the $7 million, all listing himself as the principal investigator on cooperative agreements with nonprofit. Do any of Dr. Contractor's lines of effort present issues? Select the best answer. And I'll read these since it's such small print. A, no, as a faculty member with USU and core personnel at AIM, Dr. Contractor can represent AIM and is properly carrying out nonprofit's cooperative agreement with USU in furtherance of a public purpose. B, yes, Dr. Contractor cannot represent AIM and must identify himself using verbal introduction, physical ID badges, business cards as contractor in order to avoid creating an impression that he is a government employee. C, yes, Dr. Contractor's drafting of the new research with nonprofit presents an issue if it was done while working on nonprofit's existing cooperative agreement with AIM, under which his position description does not include drafting proposals for future USU funding. D, yes, since he is a nonprofit employee, Dr. Contractor must receive a waiver in order to be the PI on USU-sponsored research and needs to have a federal official appointed to conduct any inherently governmental activities. E, both B and D, F, B, C, and D. G, does it really matter?
Thank you. And with that, Mr. Martinez, Tony, will you please? Oh, I see you've already done it. Poll question 3 is open. The responses are there, and I invite you to respond. If you can, please respond in the poll so that we can capture your response. Thank you. Okay, it looks like just about the same number of people have replied to this one that replied to the previous polls. I'll give it another 10 seconds or so. Thank you. Will you please close the poll, Tony? Ms. Stanton?
All right, so I'm going to say bah humbug to whoever selected does it really matter. Yes, that is why I have a job. Thank yous, kudos to those of you who selected F indeed. There are concerns in many of those ways. I understand that some individuals feel as a faculty appointment, despite the fact that you're a contractor employee, that you can represent USU, but there are conflicts of interest as your duty and your loyalty lies in the person that you are employed with, and your obligations under those cooperative agreements are towards your employer. You're a partner of USU's. So indeed, the Dr. Contractor can't represent USU, must identify himself using badges, using email signatures, things of that nature. Drafting of new research presents an issue unless you are specifically tasked under the existing cooperative agreement to be drafting future proposals. And D, if you were listening earlier in this, we stated that you need to secure a PI waiver if you are a contractor, despite the fact that you have any professor position. So thanks to those of you who humored me to answer these questions. Next slide. As I stated, I am one of 4 full-time attorneys in the Office of General Counsel. I primarily advise on agreements, contracts, fiscal law, tech transfer, and ethics. And I may have spoken with some of you in the past. I can see from a lot of the names that I have, as many of the general counsels of the various nonprofits have given me permission to share information or have conversations with you, either with or without an attorney present, as long as I'm not providing you with legal advice. But as always, the legal advisor to a nonprofit is the attorney of that nonprofit, and USU attorneys should only be responding to legal queries that are submitted by federal employees. So my counsel to our PIs from OGC should be entirely consistent with what the PIs are hearing from all of the speakers before me, and there shouldn't be any OGC surprises. With that said, there are different policy, regulatory, and legal requirements that some of the offices may not be thinking of when they're providing their reviews or enhancements to the products. And what this means is that a SAL might have scientific integrity and receive the full support of VPR, but when I look at the SAL through my lens, I find that it's insufficient to perhaps merely be cut and pasted into a legal document. Now, as Ms. Whitmire noted earlier in this presentation, there have been a number of changes to the legal landscape. You just heard from Victoria Cunningham the uniform guidance changes. Additionally, this past summer, the SecDef issued a memo requiring DoD components to request reimbursement from non-DoD entities for support. So gone are the days of entering into MOUs or support agreements agreements or various other agreements whereby USU does not charge for the services that its personnel or for any other services that it provides to other federal agencies or non-federal agencies. I believe I answered the question we received on the under recovery program. Why should PIs include their salaries since they're federal military personnel? They do charge. We do charge salaries. We don't provide free support to others outside the DoD, so no free lunch. Next slide, please. What I hope to convey to you is that USU is doing things well and our nonprofit partners are doing things well, we hope in collaboration. So to avoid any surprises, we've recently issued PPM 001-2020, and this was issued by VFA under Mr. Tingling, and it's entitled Interactions Between Federal and Contractor Personnel. So this is important to read for anybody who's operating either as a contractor for USU's benefit and on USU's behalf or collaborators with USU. And you'll note in the distinction on the slide that I've indicated staff on a PESMOA on overarching agreements under our special authorities or under FAR-based contracts or contractors in support of USU. Collaborators with USU are those working under federal assistance agreements, CRADAs, etc. Forthcoming, there will be a USU Instruction 7044 on use of USU authorities. And that instruction is going to lay out a lot of information about responsibilities and roles and the various agreements that USU can and cannot enter into. I'll highlight for both of you quickly a little bit that you'll see in each of those policies. If you haven't already read the PPM, you'll see that we talk about no inherently governmental functions. Federal personnel may not supervise contractor personnel. You can't tell a contractor who to hire for you. Of course, you're encouraged to have frequent daily dialogue, feedback, and things of that nature, but you must work within the confines of the contract or cooperative agreement or scope of work. Even if a PI or department chair or senior leadership asks for a task to be completed and it isn't in the statement of work under which you're operating, the contractor needs to decline, needs to begin a negotiation between the grants officers to authorize work. So we cannot hear things such as, well, because of the pandemic, I had to start performing patient care, or the senior leader pulled me for this surprise project. Of course, we need to be flexible, and we certainly are, but we need to make sure that the terms under which they're working state that you are doing those duties. So, and then the USU Instruction 7044 talks a lot about appropriations and use of the Economy Act, a little bit about conferences and fiscal law policies, and it really supports the highest quality project narrative. Just so to reiterate what my colleague Victoria Cunningham says, we talk about the paperwork and the selection factors of our nonprofit partners. While we do acknowledge that USU has sole source authority to engage with nonprofits, that doesn't excuse USU from eliminating any conflicts of interest, nor does it excuse our federal employees from not showing partiality towards one entity over another. So we'll adhere to regulations and policies, providing transparency and fair opportunities, and make best efforts to really be deliberative and document our decisions as to who our partners are and how we're making those decisions. Something else that USU is doing well is flexibility. So if it expedites our research or our other projects for us to engage in an IAA support agreement versus a CRADA, we can work with other federal entities through the IAA. If they need to use a CRADA, we will pull in a non-federal partner to document that rather than create multiple documents. So we're very flexible in using all the instruments at our disposal to try to get something done with quality and with efficiency. I also think what USU is doing well is in filing invention disclosures, consulting with either the Joint Office of Technology Transfer or with the Office of General Counsel for the Geneva employees prior to your publications or presentations, so that we're maintaining protection of our IP and not disclosing things and then losing the right to file that patent in the future. Next slide, please. Now, while I'll state that USU is doing a number of things of which I'm proud of, and we've really been getting certainly on the right track, there are a number of things for which USU can certainly do better. And that is highlighting the public purpose. We have forms now. We know that not everything USU does has a public purpose. And so if you're questioning, well, why am I on a federal assistance agreement versus a procurement contract? If work is being done under a procurement contract, it's being done with the direct benefit intended of the federal government and USU. Whereas work being done on a federal assistance award, a cooperative agreement, is being done for the direct benefit of the public, not for USU's purpose and in service of USU personnel. So clear articulation of the public purpose will help Victoria Cunningham's team and the PI work together to figure out the right instrument for a project to be on to meet the intent of all involved. And I'm just reiterating again what Victoria said. It's very important for our project narratives to be translated to results. We want to make sure that we're paying attention in these narratives focused on data, on ownership. There are times when issues arise despite our best efforts to work well together, and we need to be able to look at that narrative and the responsibilities in that cooperative agreement and state, hey, USU was on the hook for that. It's our responsibility, and our partners need to hold us accountable for that. Or we need to be able to hold our partners accountable and state, we're not going to state us collectively are going to do XYZ task, when really in reality we were expecting that this entity was going to take on that task and the other entity was going to do task B. This is a hard challenge. I know that things aren't going to be easy as we transition. It's hard to state goals, even if they're ambitious ones, but that's what we're expected to do. So gone are the days where we just list, 3 tasks. We need to state goals and metrics and show how we're shooting for the moon so that we can issue reports on whether we did so. That may state we're going to get in X number of publications this year. We're going to make X number of connections. Things of that nature are important objectives that we want to see in the forthcoming proposals this fiscal year. Moving on to ethics. It's absolutely critical for financial and foreign conflicts of interest to be disclosed. So I'll talk about that a little bit because earlier in this presentation, Dr. Randolph mentioned that OGC has an enhanced role in PI waiver requests. We have an enhanced role in everything we've been touching lately because we really want to conduct these conflict of interest screenings. It's an ongoing requirement. It protects the integrity of the research that's sponsored by USU. So we need to conduct foreign influence screening requirements. They were first driven by guidance issued by Dr. Collins at NIH for NIH-funded research with serious concerns about foreign influence, and a number of highly publicized federal investigations and prosecutions have shaken the academic research world. DoD issued similar guidance for DoD organizations to safeguard against foreign influence in research and to screen to learn more about potential researchers and collaborators. So as a result, USU, OGC, all USU stakeholders are screening with greater scrutiny than you may have seen in the past. Additionally, with ethics, you'll see the sub-bullets that if it's in a narrative, it is not an outside activity request for our federal employees. If it's in a cooperative agreement as an obligation of our cooperative agreement recipient, it's not a gift to USU. And while we're not seeing federal travel anymore on future awards, in some past awards, if federal travel was stated on them, it's not 1353 gifted travel if it's part of an already approved award signed off by a grants officer. I already talked a little bit about this. Contractor employees with salaries as direct costs do not draft proposals for USU future funds. As I've shared before, we are ensuring fair opportunities to any nonprofit collaborator. And as such, we need to ensure that our contractor employees are working within the parameter of the scope of work and on that current award that they're on within the parameter of the agreement. If you have questions, ask your grants officer. Finally, the final point is our PIs Really, any of our federal employees should not be signing documents on behalf of USU unless they're certain that they have the authority to do so. And we worked really hard this year to carve in opportunities for to sign at the lowest level when that's appropriate. So there are times when it's not Dr. Thomas signing, when it's VPR signing, when it might be a dean signing, even some letters of authorship or certain letters that our own federal employees can sign with their department's chair's concurrence or supervisor's concurrence. But please, I implore you to not ask a federal employee to sign anything for you. If you're doing it, please CC OGC or ensure that they're checking with OGC, because it's an effort that I'm trying to spread the word. Please don't just sign anything. And I'm asking you out of respect to be sure it's going through the proper process. And if the federal employee doesn't know if they can sign it, feel free to ask me. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share all this information for you. Thank you so much. I'll turn it back over to Dr. Randolph.
Thank you, Ms. Stanton. Next slide, please. This is health and safety will be presented by Lieutenant Colonel Brian Champagne.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Randolph. Yeah, so I'm the Assistant Vice President. For those of you who don't know me, Assistant Vice President for Health and Safety and Director of the Environmental Health and Occupational Safety Department. I have the next slide. So my intent here, it'll be a quick few slides, is to kind of advertise or re-advertise what we're doing and point out a few things along the way that may have changed. So the first one is, I have across the top our divisions, which are industrial hygiene, occupational safety, and radiation safety. At the beginning of this year, there was a reorganization where occupational health was realigned with family medicine, but we still work very closely with them. And I've made this with points of contact and phone numbers. If you want to, hopefully this would be something that you could use as a reference when you save the presentation. First one is training that we provide. A lot of that through the EHS Assist is provided online, so that's fairly straightforward. If there's anything you'd like to see added or changed, certainly let us know. And then there's the lab-specific training, which goes, like it says, specifically towards what you and your staff are actually doing in the lab, to address those, to include things like the chemical hygiene plans, biosafety manuals, and establishing standard or reviewing standard operating procedures. Points of contact for that, Peter Bama, who most everybody knows, Master Sergeant Havens is our Air Force active duty member who's working with the chemical hygiene plans, and then I'm the radiation safety officer, so things dealing with radiation lasers would be there. On the next column, the job hazard analysis. If you have new equipment that you're bringing in, or some new protocol, or if it's something that existing that you're just recognizing needs some safety precautions, or you want to have us come take a look, we're available to do that anytime. Daryl White's our industrial hygienist. Safety guides is a product that we've just kind of created this year. So there's over 25 different guides, ranging from biosafety cabinets to dry ice handling to welding. Again, if I'll point out on the slide with the website, where you can find those. And again, if there's other ones you want to use or something you would like to see in there, certainly let us know. Chemical fume hoods, for any of the labs that have chemical fume hoods, we go around to do surveys for those to make sure they're still in spec. And if if there's an issue that's found, we coordinate or help coordinate between facilities and log to get those adjustments made so that it can come back into compliance. And we're getting better at that as far as figuring out who's doing which piece of that. Next slide, please. You've got concerns about a process that may cause a breathing hazard. First stop would be to contact Paul Gorham he'll do the evaluation to make measurements of what people are being exposed to or potentially exposed to, and then go through the process from there. Similar to that, if there's a indoor air quality issue, and some of those may be urgent, like if there's a gas smell, we will respond immediately to those. Other ones we can do longer studies if necessary. Paul Graham's a point of contact for that as well. For the chemical storage and chemical waste and biological waste, our point of contact is Chris Andrino. He's fairly new with us to the team, so he has been very helpful at going out and getting into labs and helping out with chemical storage, making that getting it into compliance. And another kind of good news thing with Chris is he's coming with a lot of experience in hazardous waste and the kind of procedures and forms that we were needing to do for a while. In many cases are not going to be necessary. So the first stop would be just to contact Chris if you have hazardous waste, and most often he's able to pick it right up and make it very easy for you. Radioactive waste is handled by Bruce Gray. It's a contractor working for us. Or occupational illness and injury reports. The purpose here is to document what happened in case it's needed for a workman's comp case, or overall our main purpose is we want to understand what happened and try and make recommendations to prevent these kinds of things happening in the future. And kind of throughout all of those, I just wanted to say kind of once at the end rather than repeating myself throughout there. If we find something that needs some attention, or you come to us with something that you've identified as a problem, our intent is not for that to be a gotcha moment where we can write you up and tell on you. We're really here to try and help people out. So if you come to us with something, we're going to try and find the best, easiest way to get into compliance, or to resolve the concern, rather than just trying to write you up. Last slide that I have is next slide, please. Yeah, so this is just pointing out our EHS website. So I have arrows there to just kind of point out the safety guides are right, front and center. At the top, there's different pull-down menus for the 3 divisions that we have, and occupational health services, although they're in family medicine, we still link on our website to get to the various training activities. There's a training tab there, and a separate one for hazardous waste. Kind of in the middle is to get started off with the accident report, and down in the with the larger icons brings you to the same divisions as you can find up above, or all the way to the left is to log on with EHS Assistant. Just kind of point out the purple down in the bottom is one of many ways to report an issue. So if you or one of your employees has something, one of the ways is to use these web forms. There's an anonymous option as well. Or, just give us a call, or, email contact, whoever you're most comfortable with contacting for us. And that's really, like I said, that's going to be quick. Again, we're here as a resource for you, much more so than we are trying to work as police. We're trying to help you all, be safe and compliant, and keep your labs open. With that, I'll thank you for your attention and turn it back over to Dr. Randolph.
Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Champagne. Next slide, please. Well, we want to thank each and every one of you for participating in the training. We realize that it's Friday afternoon, it's sunny outside, and we just really appreciate those of you who are able to stay on and listen to the full training. We will shift into our Q&A, but before we do that, next slide, please. I just want to make sure that call your attention to some of the future training events that are listed here on this slide, and of course there will be others throughout the year. Please, if you have not already done so, and I can't necessarily help you, guide you to how to do this, but if you are not getting announcements from the research announcements email, it would be great if you could sign up for that. Oftentimes, many of the announcements we send are not able to go through to USU All. So please make sure you're signed up to the research announcements email group. And with that, next slide. We'll move into our questions and answers. Mary Kay Gibbons is on the line, and she will facilitate the questions and answers. Mary Kay?
Good afternoon. The first question I have is for Tony Whitmire, and the question is, on the URP, why should PIs include their salary? Since they are federal/military personnel, they don't charge their salary on grants.
Mary Kay, thank you for that question. So the rationale for a faculty member to include their salary in an application or an award application to another external sponsor is that the Department of Defense has paid for the salary of the faculty member to perform Department of Defense work. When the faculty member is performing work for others, work for those who are not part of the Defense Health Program and overall Department of Defense, it is very acceptable, reasonable, and in many cases required by policy to ensure that the Department of Defense is appropriately charging others for the work that it does. This policy changed at the end of June. The Secretary of Defense issued some guidance that DoD was not to be performing work for others outside of DoD for free. So therefore, that's one of the reasons why we look at the applications very carefully to determine whether it is, in that particular case, whether it is appropriate to include the faculty member's salary. We like to see what else is in that budget. But that's sort of the background as to why it is appropriate.
Thank you, Tony. The next question is going to go to Sharday Randall. And the question is, how does the NCE approval/notification process for the OSP differ from the NCE approval process in acquisitions? Are the documents entered into a workflow when submitted to acquisitions and flow down to OSP, or are these separate processes? Sharday?
Thank you, Mary Kay. I believe Victoria had mentioned what the ACQ no-cost extension process is, and within OSP, the process will be the same. All documents that's pertaining to no-cost extension, which includes your 3208, your 3210, your justification memo, budget and budget justification, your statement of work, and sponsor approval letter should be submitted to OSP. Now, as far as a workflow, when we upload our documents into the VPR site database to process a NOR with your signed 3208, which is your indication that the VPR office has reviewed your no-cost extension and has approved it, then I believe the workflow will be finances next and then acquisitions. I'm not sure that they can see the same documents that we have. I believe Victoria can speak on that, but they the links will be there provided to them.
Yeah, so I think the important takeaway, just to add to that for a moment from ACQ, is that when USU Acquisitions Directorate has issued an award to a recipient, ultimately, while there might be the internal USU processes, from an ACQ perspective, we're accepting that documentation, but also we're waiting for the recipient organization to formally submit that request, because ultimately it's the recipient organization who's responsible for the award and needs to indicate to our office that a no-cost extension request is in fact required or is being requested. So we have documentation that we receive internally, but we're ultimately waiting for that recipient package to come through so we can review, approve, and subsequently modify the agreement accordingly.
Thank you, Victoria and Sade. The next question is actually going to go to Victoria, and it is for the NCE, who is the sponsor approval if it is a USU award?
So if the USU has issued an award and there is potentially an outside sponsor, so let's say another agency that's providing funding, and that agency has worked with our IAA office, Mr. Gwinnup's shop, to establish an IAA. When I'm receiving a request for an award that has that type of sponsor, I'm going to be looking at the no-cost extension request from the recipient in light of any restrictions or requirements that are delineated in that IAA documentation, which I think Mr. Gwinnup spoke a little bit about that earlier today. If this is just a USU award, there is not outside funding being received. Again, to go back to, OSP has their role in terms of the review and approval related to those no-cost extension requests. And then ultimately, again, what we're looking for is that recipient request that comes into the acquisitions office that we can then review, approve, or potentially ask any questions about and approve, and then ultimately modify the award.
Thank you, Victoria. Victoria, the next question is for you also. Reference Acquisition Directorate and Project Narrative. Does this reporting apply to all research projects or only government-sponsored research? Example, if a PI has an NIH SPIR grant that is funded previously and you are the sub-PI, do you have to give milestones, reporting, etc.?
Well, I am apparently very popular today, so thank you all for all the questions. This is good that people were listening and paying attention. So in terms of the project narrative, so the project narrative is going to be required for any award that USU Acquisitions Directorate is going to be issuing. So if you are the sub-PI, and if I think I understand the scenario correctly, I don't know that I would be in my office issuing that award. And so in that case, you would be following any requirements for reporting, et cetera, that have been established, it looks like with NIH and others. If USU Acquisitions Directorate is issuing an award and you are serving in support of that award that has been issued to a recipient, the project narrative requirement and the reporting and metrics that I talked about and those reporting requirements are a requirement for a USU issued award.
This is Tony. Can I speak up here? Yeah, I think the scenario has to do with an award that a PI might have received as a sub-award through a nonprofit partner. So say, for example, University of Texas received the prime award from NIH, and then University of Texas issued a sub-award to a nonprofit partner, and the USU was a PI on that sub-award. In that case, your reports would go back to the organization that issued will be submitted by the nonprofit partner to the organization you're receiving the award from. But the PI would also be responsible for completing a 3210, and then they could attach a copy of their report to the 3210 face page and then present that to OSP. That wouldn't necessarily have to go to acquisitions because acquisitions wasn't involved in any award in this process.
And I'll chime in from OGC's standpoint. There are times in that scenario that Tony just brought up where USU is asked to sign paperwork to acknowledge certain obligations under those sub awards. And in that case, then it's Andy Gwinnep's shop that'll sometimes route those letters of acknowledgement, and OGC will review those before any USU signature is applied on them. So our PIs don't have authority to sign any commitment like that without that process being in place. Thanks. Over.
Thank you, guys. Our next question is going to go to Laura Broche, and it's, there was no mention of DHA survey research approval process. When should this occur in relation to grant submission? Dr. Broche? And I will go to Dr. Rasmussen to answer.
Okay, so survey research does go through the Human Research Protections Office. I would say in the grant submission, typically part of the research question is included in the grant submission, but it would also be handled in terms of approval in a just-in-time situation. Adding on to that, we would request that you coordinate closely with the Human Research Protections Office. They can give you guidance on what would probably pass and what would not. And also along those lines, there is a new National Defense Acquisitions, is that right? Authorization Act, excuse me, the NDAA for 2021. They are including a temporary exemption for USU from the Paperwork Reduction Act, which may impact survey research. So it hasn't passed yet, I believe, but it is going through the motions in the Congress. So in the future, that may change the way that survey research is approved.
Thank you, Susan. The next question is going to be for Dr. Randolph. And that's basically, can an employee of a NPP assist the federal PI with documents needed for submission of a grant, such as a 3208, project narrative, etc.? Is it considered a conflict of interest? Dr. Randolph?
Thank you, Mary Kay. I think you might get different answers depending on who you ask this question. From my perspective, I think that the employees should be providing support to the faculty members, particularly if you already have the bio sketches and all of the other requirements for submission. However, I think that our nonprofit partners may have different rules, and I would be interested in hearing from Ms. Stanton as well. But I think that that's the role of having department level support is to help the PIs. Over.
Thanks, Dr. Randolph. I'll agree with you. I think it's perfectly appropriate for an award to include first of all, what the employee needs to do is look at the contract or the agreement or the award under which they're working and really pay attention to what the scope is of that award or of that contract and what their position description is under the contract. Does it say that that's what you're here to do? So, for example, if we're talking about a contractor employee or a PESMO, a staff member who's working in service of USU, it could be perfectly appropriate and they're part of their position description to assist in that way. If we're talking about an employee on a cooperative agreement, it may be perfectly appropriate and it may be stated in that agreement that this employee will prepare documents to submit for non-DoD funding. So what I really encourage you to do is to pay attention to the document in the vehicle under which you're working to be sure that that's what you were paid for and hired to do. Because I, behind the scenes, do my legal review and work with Victoria Cunningham and say, this is proposing for somebody to get paid to get more USU money later. I'm gonna scratch that, but I'm gonna allow this because this is clearly intended to enhance future research efforts and is not a conflict of interest. So just look to the vehicle under which you're funded. Over.
Thank you. The next question actually is for Sarah, and it is, Ms. Stanton, I think I heard you say that the government does now charge for a PI's time. Did I hear you correctly? Although I'm a contractor, I assume it's okay to ask you a question if the context of the presentation you're doing.
Yes, and I think Ms. Whitmire already answered this, so I'll echo what she said. In light of the SecDef memo that came out in the summer, the government is charging for a PI's time when we're offered grants, say by non-federal entities, or when we're engaging with federal entities in support of that entity. So there clearly are questions, and there have been since the summer, on unique case-by-case bases where there are two-way relationships and actually the costs of that other entity are far greater than USU's costs, and so we document that and why we're not charging. So if there are any questions in this, feel free to ask. There are certainly a variety of unique circumstances, and we're all learning together. Over.
Thank you, Sarah. I just want to say I see some people asking questions in the chat. If you want to have your questions brought forward, please put them in the Q&A, which again, if you go to the top, you'll see a little pyramid with a triangle, a square, and a circle. And the third one down says Q&A. If you click on that, you can add your question in there. All right. And the next question is going to go to Tony Whitmire. And it is, so if we can now charge for our work, then does this mean we can charge for our salary on a grant request and they will reimburse the salary with the funding? Tony?
Thank you for the question, Mary Kay. The answer depends on where the sponsored funding is coming from. If the sponsor of the effort is Department of Defense, then the faculty member's salary has already been funded by the Department of Defense. If the sponsor's funding is coming from somewhere else, another federal department or another private entity or some other not-for-profit entity, if those are the sponsors, then yes, faculty time may be included in the budget. So this is the same question that Ms. Stanton just answered as well.
Thank you, Tony. The next question is going to go to Dr. Randolph, our Tony Martinez, and that's when routing a 3208 for signatures, approval of personnel/PI in a different department. Can the 3208 be amended to reflect additional slots for signatures to avoid formulating several different forms?
I'm sure that Tony Martinez would agree with me that there are so many different versions of the 3208. The one that I thought was the most recent had several several positions for multiple chairs to sign. Again, we are updating this form this month and hope to release the newest, most recent version early January, but it'll certainly come out in January. And we'll try to make sure that we accommodate space for several signatures. Thank you. Tony, do you have anything to add?
Well, depending on the situation, I think it's best if, a specific situation, if the form doesn't cover a specific situation, we can cross that bridge when we get to it and perhaps create a specific form just for that. But, creating a form that's going to handle everything as far as signatures go, with how PDF, Adobe works, it's kind of difficult.
Thank you. But I guess the different forms, that's a little concerning for me. So having to have, if we encourage collaboration across departments, and so I think we need to figure out a way to not have to have, for instance, 3 different 3208s. And so we can talk offline about how best to do that. I would agree with you, and I understand the complexities involved with Adobe. But yes, we'll work on that. Thank you.
Thank you. The last question we have in the box, we're going to give it to Victoria. What is the process to change PI percent effort after 2 years in a multiple year project, 3 years or more? Is this the same for both intramural and or extramural?
So OSP might be a little bit better able to address any reviews or requirements that they have in terms of their documentation. I can't speak to that. What I can say is if there's a concern about needing to change a PI's percentage of effort, or really any modification that's needed that has, a budgetary impact or an impact to the agreement that has been reached between USU and the recipient, then that needs to be routed to our office. We just need an explanation of what the changes that's needed. We need to receive the updated documentation associated with that to reflect the most comprehensive, up-to-date documentation that we can then modify into the award. I don't know if OSP has anything that they'd like to say in particular about any of those changes or monitoring that they do in relation to this.
Thank you. I'll ask Kaisha to please comment, but I would echo what you said. We need to have updated documentation and a justification as to why the change is occurring. And again, if it impacts the budget, then we need a new budget and budget justification. Kaisha, do you have anything to add to that?
No, ma'am, you both stated correctly. We would need the same updated documentation, but the request form would have to be submitted to receive a folder for that as well.
Thank you.
And from OGC's perspective, there's increased regulatory scrutiny when we're reducing the PI percentage of effort under cooperative agreements. So we need to be careful about that. Over.
Thank you. And that's the last question that's in the box.
I think there is one last question that was added a few minutes ago. Is it possible to not be so descriptive in the signature blocks on the 3208 after the first investigator and their department chair's signature? We'll take that into consideration as we update the form. Thank you, Mary Kay. With that, I would like to thank you all again. I'd like to thank all of the presenters and my colleagues who presented today. I'd like to thank Mr. Martinez for assisting us from behind the scenes, as well as staff members from Royce Goddard's office and the CIO's office, Jeff Johns, I believe Matthew Booth, and Derek Williams, if I recall correctly. Thank you all for joining us. And again, we're available. Reach out to us as you prepare your applications and or once you receive your awards. We're here to help. Thank you. Over.